And well, we have just successfully held a two-day G20 summit, and though India has now passed on the baton, or rather the gavel, to Brazil, there are some key big takeaways from the summit that happened over the 2 days. Now, G20 summit is a diplomatic win for India, marked by the rapid consensus reached among nations on various issues. In a first of its kind, an enormous trade and infrastructure endeavor connecting India, the Middle East and Europe was presented on the day one of the summit. As a part of the proposal, ports, electricity, data networks and energy pipelines are slated to be developed. Now, it is anticipated that it will serve as a counterbalance to China's Belt and Road Initiative, commonly known as the BRI. This comes as BRI has fueled worries regarding Beijing's increasing footprint across at least 3 continents. Apart from countering the BRI, the economic corridor is anticipated to spur economic growth by utilizing improved connectivity and economic integration between Asia, the Gulf and Europe. Meanwhile, in what can be called as a major development, Italy is likely to walk out of China's BRI. Remember, Italy is the only G7 nation to sign up to the BRI. Now, Bharat shines at the G20, and as we speak of that, if we are to take a quick analysis of the takeaways and the highlights from the summit itself, the 5 big takeaways are: firstly, to begin with, the Modi magic and the Prime Minister's guarantees worked for an adoption of the G20 declaration, a path-breaking declaration consensus. The economic corridor is the second point which we were just discussing about. It is the biggest challenge now to the BRI. Now, for the first time since the creation of the G20, it has expanded and now truly has the voice of the global south. The lead is being taken by developing countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil and South Africa. And the complete isolation of China is another crucial point that we have noticed at this G20 summit. The summit has shown that the world has moved on from China. And they've also decided to invest only in SCO and BRICS, where they are the fulcrum. So China is basically going insulated and out of the West dominated multilateral platforms and forums. Now, a big win for Modi. This particular summit that took place is a big win for the Prime Minister. He has delivered on all counts, be it the 15 bilaterals that were held on the sidelines of the G20 or the 200 plus G20 meetings. Prime Minister Modi made it a people's presidency indeed. So these are the particular takeaways we are speaking of. Of course, the key is the very fact that the G20 declaration had come out in the very first day itself, despite there being a lot of speculation regarding a consensus to be reached over the declaration. And we will take you further point by point about India's G20 presidency and how it was a triumph for India. The 5 takeaways as we are focusing on. Consensus on New Delhi Leaders Declaration. This is one of the biggest points that have come out, the New Delhi Leaders Declaration, which has come out on the very first day of the summit itself. Second is the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, a corridor which is now a challenge to the Belt and Road Initiative of China. Then the African Union becoming a member of the G20. So now what we know is it's 19 countries and 2 unions, the European Union and the African Union, that are the members of G20. And then we have China's isolation at international forums. That is another big point, because remember, China has missed this summit and a lot of speculation has got into that as well, which we will get into later. Modi government made it a people's presidency, as we have constantly been focusing on how the Modi government has constantly brought out the human-centric growth, and it is the people's presidency of Prime Minister Modi that we are constantly focusing on. And right now we have Pallavi Ghosh joining us on the broadcast. Pallavi, a very good morning to you. And as we were just discussing the 5 big takeaways, and I think I will come to you point by point. The first one being A, the New Delhi Declaration, and B, the economic corridor that has been signed on, that posing as a major challenge to the BRI. How are we looking at these 2 events?
When I was there and we were covering the G20 summit, even on day one, there was a lot of cynicism frankly speaking, even within some of the quarters of the government, because they were worried whether the G20 summit would actually be able to come up with a New Delhi declaration. And suddenly you had the Prime Minister announcing it. And, as expected, he was surrounded by a round of applause, because this was not an easy declaration to come out with. First of all, it is in the backdrop of the COVID scenario. Countries are facing a lot of competition. Parts of UK, for example, Birmingham yesterday has declared a recession and bankruptcy. So there was a worry among many of the countries is that how much should we stress on economic cooperation and helping each other out if we are not able to help ourselves first. Putting ourselves first, being selfish, that is something which many countries were very concerned about, that that's what we need to do. And that is one success story, to come out with a declaration. A success bigger story is what you talked about, is actually the Prime Minister being able to convince the countries, yes, these are tough times, you need to protect yourself, but you cannot do so in a world in where you're constantly fighting with each other. And therefore, economic cooperation, that has been the hallmark of the G20 summit. And not just that, incorporating the private sector. They have the money, they have the resources. And if you look at the Delhi Declaration, very categorically says, let's not distance ourselves away from the corporate sector. The private sector is very integral to development of any country, which means a huge amount of money and resources are going to be available to a G20 countries as far as economic development is concerned. And third, I don't even need to mention it, but we have been talking about it. Cryptocurrency on the agenda, international taxation, so that only the countries of origin of big giants of MNCs like Facebook, X, Amazon, are not the only ones who benefit. The countries on which they operate from, where they are making a large amount of money from, like India, they also should actually get the benefits of these operations. So that's been a huge success story. Biofuel Global Alliance, again a huge success story in terms of catering to the rising energy needs, reduce the dependence on fossil fuel. You make a cleaner, greener, cheaper environment and the world. And of course, the corridor we are talking about. But not what was overriding in all of this is a kind of checkmating of China, because if something which has brought all of them together, whether it's Russia, France, UK, India, it's that fear of China, the need to take on China and to checkmate them. And I think the inclusion of the African Union is also a big achievement in that direction.
Absolutely. Now, as we speak of China, Pallavi, I want to ask you this particular question. There have been speculations about Russia and China's narrative as far as the New Delhi Declaration is concerned, because we know that there was an issue about consensus towards the beginning of this summit, whether a consensus will be reached regarding the Ukraine-Russia war and the language being used in the declaration. How are we looking at what Russia and China might have gotten out of this declaration?
But I mean, if you see it from the point of view of the Russians, I mean, you had a press conference from them and they acknowledged the success of the G20 summit. But the fact that they were not named in the New Delhi Declaration when we were talking about Ukraine, that their side would see it as a diplomatic success, because that is something which they did not want. But in terms of energy needs, in terms of the fact that we understand that there needs to be a coexistence of the green biofuel along with fossil fuel, I think that is also one little catering to Russia. At the end of the day, when you ink these kind of economic deals, you also ensure that foreign investment is acknowledged, greater interaction is also encouraged. In that sense, Russia has nothing to complain about. However, as far as China is concerned, I would see that as a setback to them. I think China also understood that coming on the table would mean that there would be a checkmating of them. African Union inclusion, energy needs, greater cooperation, and the setting up of the corridor, all of them are very obvious attacks and digs at China, and China knows that.
Right. Pallavi, actually, to continue with the focus on China, we also had heard an interview with the Brazil President Lula da Silva, and he had also said that this is a big miss for China. He should have attended the G20 summit. And given that the current economic crisis that China is also going through, the kind of struggles they are facing back at home with their economy as well, how big of a miss was this for China? What kind of a shadow does it cast upon them?
I mean, frankly speaking, to take forward the point which the Brazilian president is making, and this is something which was felt in the diplomatic quarters also, that perhaps if Chinese were there with a high-level delegation, they would have been able to ask for more concessions for themselves. They would not have felt left out the way they have been from the G20 summit. And on the negotiating table, it always helps to communicate and talk. even if for record they had shown a resistance or dissent with the setting up of the corridor, it would actually have gone on record. Well, they missed that chance, they missed that opportunity, and as I said, the fact that there are countries like Russia, not Russia, but America, France, UK, and of course India, who are worried about and are not very happy with the expansionist kind of policies of China. This was clearly a missed bus by the Chinese authorities. Perhaps they could have been present. And very quickly, before I come back to you, the fact that the President of the United States goes to Hanoi after his visit to New Delhi is again significant, because that's another axis where the former enemies come together to take on China. Increasing strength on the Indo-Pacific region as a counter to China is another step forward as far as these negotiations are concerned.